Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Athena Donald and I'm the Master of Churchill College. One of the few joys of this pandemic is that it is possible to host virtually much larger audiences than would be possible in person in the college, and we have a very large attendance indeed for tonight's discussion. Churchill College was founded as the National and Commonwealth Memorial to Sir Winston Churchill. To many of our members, past and present, Churchill was the supreme leader during the Second World War, whose courage and wisdom led to the defeat of Hitler and fascism. However, both during the war and throughout his long life and career, Churchill expressed views and took actions which impacted adversely on different communities at home and abroad. His views on race and empire have had their own legacy, but one which is less well known. As master of this college, I believe we must explore Churchill's multifaceted character and actions and not back away from recognizing complex truths and acknowledging difficult realities. As I said in my introduction to the first event in our series of Churchill, Race and Empire, our aim is to engage accurately and truthfully with all aspects of our founder and foundation, and by better understanding our past, seek to better shape our future. That is why it is important that this specific initiative is complemented by further work on greater inclusivity within the current college community. This further work I mention is part of the overarching and ongoing work of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee that I chair, and which is exploring all parts of the college's operation and culture. We must not shy away from matters that may be uncomfortable to some or that are so ingrained in the way the majority think about day-to-day life that we're blind to their impact on others. This work includes a scholarly and critical reassessment of Churchill's life and actions, and this is what tonight is all about, to provide an appropriate academic forum. But it reaches far beyond to our entire community membership, our decision-making processes, and our daily actions. I am determined that these issues are kept centre stage and not just initiated and then kicked into the long grass. As a child brought up in the London of the 50s and 60s, I was well aware of tensions around race and the racism that was prevalent in everything from jobs and pay to the football pitch. Bomb sites were familiar sights, keeping the war in focus, and the narrative of Churchill, the supreme war leader, was familiar to me. However, one of the topics of tonight's conversation, what happened in India at the same time, was not something that I knew anything about. And I'm sure in this, I'm typical of many of my generation and succeeding ones. We need to be cognizant of the racial issues that went unreported or which played out further from these shores. I look forward to learning more tonight. And now I'll pass over to Professor Priya Gopal, who's going to chair the discussion.
Thank you, Athene, and welcome to everyone today. It's great to have so many of you at this event. Thanks are due to Professor Donald, the Master of the College, and to the Archives Centre and its director, Alan Packwood, and the College for insisting rightly that it is the solemn responsibility of educational institutions to undertake full and critical historical reassessment of important figures and legacies, even and especially when they involve acknowledging difficult truths. This event is a part of a wider effort to start a national conversation about Winston Churchill's legacies in relation to race and empire, but not just about Churchill. Indeed, no discussion about Churchill is just about Churchill. It is necessary to break the wider silence on how empire and race have shaped contemporary Britain. This is less about the reputation of a long deceased individual in the tradition of great man history, although it is necessary to fill in some of the blanks there as well, and more about examining a national narrative that has grown up around this figure and its consequences, not least in what we don't talk about. Today, Winston Churchill is less an individual in history and far more a symbol of Britain's official view of itself. Rather than the individual, it is the meanings invested in what some have called variously the cult of Winston Churchill or the Churchill industry, and that's what requires analysis. The great scholar Edward Said noted, more important than the past itself is its bearing upon cultural attitudes in the present. That the very holding of this event has upset so many speaks volumes about those cultural attitudes and the continuing pressure to leave out less glorious bits of history. Having difficult but necessary conversations is not an easy task to undertake in an era where mythology and hagiography are preferred to honesty and informed reflection, especially by many in politics and sadly the media. Historians and scholars who don't think history should be treated as a comfort blanket or a warm bath with candles have to constantly negotiate weaponized fragility and, quite frankly, a degree of cowardice. It takes courage, individual and national courage, to see history, historical events, and historical actors in their fullness. It takes a willingness to develop what writer Jamaica Kincaid calls a more demanding relationship with history, so that we come to understand who we are as people and as societies. When an event such as today's is described as idiotic, even before it takes place, it seems clear that the problem is less with what might or might not be said today, but with the very fact of having a discussion on the meaning and legacies of Winston Churchill in relation to race and empire. Getting to the heart of this particular anxiety and national silence is vital. And we must ask, what is it we are not allowed to know, talk about, or even merely raise as a topic for discussion? Should commemoration mean unconditional celebration, averting the gaze from unpleasant and troubling, but consequential truths? We hear a great deal about Britain's victory over Nazi Germany, one alongside others. But why do we not hear about a point many anti-colonial fighters from Britain's colonies raised repeatedly? How was it possible for Britain to claim to fight a war for freedom while subjugating so much of Asia and Africa? Churchill was very clear, for instance, that the freedoms and self-determination enshrined in the Atlantic Charter did not apply to Britain's colonies. What do we make of historical facts like that when commemorating the man and his legacies? It is also simply not true that he was off his time, or he was simply off his time. He was criticized robustly in his time, both for his racial views and for his unwillingness to engage with the colonies. Professor Richard Toy pointed out during our last event that many of his contemporaries also found occasion to remark on Churchill's heavily racialized worldview. Before I introduce the panel, let me comment on the other elephant in the room which has created disquiet. The three panelists and the chair, me, all very different people with very different perspectives, with 4 different regions of the world between us, are marked by the fact of not being racialized as white. Our credentials have been questioned. Scholars of color are quite used to this, of course, as has our right to speak about the topic. Let me just point out that though we share large quantities of melanin in our skin between us, which no doubt renders us controversial, we hail from 3 different continents in our heritage and are hugely different in our interests and expertise. We are also completely unfazed by racism. Where all white and indeed all male panels frequently pass without comment, indeed are the norm, this panel with 4 scholars of color has created not just unease, but also elicited startlingly the accusation that it is somehow unbalanced just by virtue of this fact. So a word about balance. Regardless of what is to be said or discussed in the next hour, to discuss Churchill and Churchillian legacies in relation to race and empire is not imbalanced. It is precisely to bring long overdue balance to a heavily skewed national story that has preferred untrammeled glorification to a balanced assessment in the round. Today's event is just one of many that will be needed if the country is to have any sort of balance at all. Most importantly, it's worth remembering that neither this particular discussion, and it is a discussion, not a debate, nor the year-long series at Churchill College focused on Churchill is about his individual or his character. More to the point, more relevant for us are the political, ethical, and ideological legacies of the Churchillian era as they shape us in Britain today and in the world beyond. To this end, we are honored to have three outstanding scholars and commentators today who will give us between them some of these missing but vital perspectives. Dr. Onyeka Nubia, who will go first, of the University of Nottingham, is a historian and fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a writer and presenter. He is the leading scholar on the status and origins of Africans in pre-colonial England from antiquity. His books, Blackamoors, Africans in Tudor England, Their Present Status and Origins, and England's Other Countrymen, Black Tudor Society, are highly well regarded, and he has published widely on these and other topics. Our second speaker is Dr. Madhusree Mukherjee, who is a writer, essayist, and senior editor at Scientific American magazine, and the author of The Land of Naked People, Encounters with Stone Age Islanders, and the much praised Churchill's Secret War, the British Empire and the Ravaging of India during World War II, which came out in 2010. Professor Kehinde Andrews is a writer, commentator, and professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. He is the author of Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, Resisting Racism, Race, Inequality, and the Black Supplementary School Movement, and has just released what is likely to become one of the books of this year with Penguin Allen Lane in the UK, and it's called The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. We will proceed in this order. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, after which we will have a discussion between ourselves and then open up the floor for general questions. You may put your questions in the Q&A. My colleagues, Dr. Lee Deno and Alan Packwood, will be looking through the questions and then asking us those questions, which we will then answer. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Onyeka Nubia.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Good. So, on being invited to do this discussion, I was struck by a number of things. First of all, that it's quite interesting and strange that only on issues of ethnicity and race is a racialized panel considered often to be the right kind of panel. For example, I'm rarely asked to discuss the life and times of Winston Churchill without the epithet of race attached to it, as if someone like myself doesn't have a perspective on Winston Churchill in the absence of ethnicity and race, or that I could be the authority on ethnicity and race simply because of how I am racialized in a white supremacist society. Notwithstanding that, I certainly do have a perspective on Winston Churchill and ethnicity and race, but it shouldn't be presumed that I have a perspective on Winston Churchill regarding ethnicity and race. So why discuss Winston Churchill at all? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, because he lived, he existed. And as historians, we are taught to value every human life. And that is a human life. He has an existence, and therefore it is relevant. He is also, or can act as, a reference point. A reference point is a person who can springboard other thoughts, ideas, and concepts. And the ideas that they espouse can be the kind of ideas that can leapfrog people's understanding of a given moment in time that is Dadalian, confusing, or even difficult to understand. Churchill is one of those individuals who is very useful in acting as a reference point. Even if you choose utterly to disparage everything that he says, he's still relevant as a reference point, especially for those who don't know about history. However, there will come a moment in time when perhaps we don't need that reference point. But being that I'm an early modern historian primarily, although not entirely, I was curious to know the context and the background upon which Churchill was sprung. We know, for example, in the recent poll that he was voted the best Briton out of 100, an all-white, essentially male list. I know there are women there, but predominantly male list, but certainly an all-white list, with the exception of Freddie Mercury. And he was voted #1. But what is the pedigree that makes him so? What is it about Winston Churchill that he is such a stalwart representation of Britishness? Well, doing some tracing, I went back as far as 1470 to William of Redborn Spencer. Now, William of Redborn Spencer is the father of the Spencers that we now know, of John Churchill and the rest. He is the father of that ancient line. Now, William of Redborn is a remarkably interesting individual in that there is so little known about him. And I found this rather strange in that he is the ancestor of the Spencer line, which includes Lady Diana Spencer and all the Spencers. He is also an ancestor of the Roosevelts, including Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, etc. And he is also an ancestor of the Camerons and also of one aspect of the Windsor family. And yet, very little research has been done. Now, he is one of those individuals who we ought to learn more about if we are to understand Churchill. So this is on the father's line. Of course, the mother's line isn't British at all. The mother's line hails from the United States of America, from Jenny Jerome. And that line originates from a Huguenot stock. Now, these are important aspects. The fact that Churchill has on his mother's line a Huguenot ancestry. Some people even claim the Native American one, but that can't be proved at the moment. But certainly a Huguenot ancestry. And this ancient line that is connected to other lines, both in the Western Hemisphere and in the Northern Hemisphere. It explains why Churchill, or helps to explain why, Churchill had such a close connection to Theodore Roosevelt, to Franklin D. Roosevelt, and why he was chosen to form that Anglo-American alliance that became so important 1940, 1941, when America was quibbling about which side it was going to bat the ball on. So this bloodline, or this connection with Churchill, helps us to understand much about the nature of ethnicity in the time frame of which Churchill was born and lived. It is an ethnicity or an ethnic identity that is framed on a European hegemony that we might now say was a white supremacist philosophy. They called it in their time an Anglo-Saxon idea of superiority. These are the terms that Churchill uses predominantly, as well as English, in his 37 books written on the question of English identity. And I would ask you all, if you're going to talk about Churchill, that at least you do read some of those 37 books. Within his books, speaking about the English-speaking world, he talks about how the Anglo-Saxon race, there is no such thing, of course, but the Anglo-Saxon race, the English race, have achieved their position on the basis of ethnicity, culture, language, and dominance. And he speaks about how this ethnic group, with their own identity, might have something spiritual about them that sets them above their cousins, the Germans. He says that the Aryan stock, or he's been attributed as saying that the Aryan stock is bound to triumph. Now, this phrase means or reveals that Churchill has strong ideas about ethnicity and race. These strong ideas about ethnicity and race are particular to a kind of Anglophile, Eurocentric, white supremacist perspective. He also is attributed as saying, a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. He was using this to refer to whether the native peoples in Oceania or the native peoples in America should be compensated for the destruction that had been brought upon them by European hegemony. Of course, Hitler as well, but Churchill was being influenced by ideas of white supremacy, such as those from Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's bulldog. Francis Galton wrote ostensibly about a concept called eugenics, an idea that the Anglo-Saxon race, to quote Thomas Huxley and to quote Churchill, should rise to the top and form a dominant position, as Cecil Rhodes claims, all over the world for the purpose of making war obsolete. In other words, war would only become obsolete once the Anglo-Saxon race achieved its dominance. It is part of a philosophy, an ideological philosophy, also used by people like George F. Cram when he created the Pyramid of Races, and by Thomas Huxley when he claimed that the Anglo-Saxon race was divine and perhaps inspired by the blood of Jesus Christ. So we can see in the opportunism with the way in which Churchill lived his life, and there is a degree of opportunism, whether you're a supporter of his ideological philosophy or him as a personality. In the moments that he chose to punctuate, the ideological philosophy of the time was his guide. So we shouldn't ask the question, or perhaps to contextualize the question about what his identity was. His identity fits within the pattern that I've just been describing. So we can see, for example, at the Sydney Street siege, that he considered that the people that he was in conflict with, Eastern Europeans, Latvians, and others, that these people were inferior to the Anglo-Saxon stock. We can see in this terrible and devastating picture in relation to the Bengal famine that the cabinet that he was part of shared similar ideas about race and nationhood and empire. These ideas about race and nationhood and empire formed through concepts and ideas about eugenics, formed from ideas by Thomas Huxley, formed from ideas from Francis Galton, formed from ideas from Cecil Rhodes, formed from ideas by historians such as J.H. Plum, who talked about the March of the Titans in reference to a white supremacist march taking over the entire world. It just so happens that these dreadful moments in time are being perpetrated by a British Empire that saw itself at odds with German militarism, but it's not that those ideas or philosophies were entirely contradictory to each other. It's just that the way German militarism and Nazism was operating, that way was not the British way. So when, for example, he is attributed as claiming that a seditious Middle Temple lawyer is now posing as Mukerjee, talking about Gandhi, this idea, when we hear it attributed to him, we should not be entirely surprised by it, because it fits within a pattern of European hegemony. I think it's important, I know I'm running out of time, I think it's also important to contextualize. We often talk about white supremacy, European hegemony, as if it is an entirely male thing, and it is not. This family that I'm showing to you are called the Mitford Sisters. And I do apologize if anybody in the audience is related to the Mitford Sisters, because I'm going to spend a few seconds here sort of decoding this group. This family is highly influential in the development of politics throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. One of these sisters was the darling of Adolf Hitler. The other sister was the spouse of Oswald Mosley. Another sister married the nephew of Winston Churchill, and another sister married into the family of Anthony Eden. This is a power-broking family, and this is a family that is strongly influenced by Nazi and fascist ideals and philosophy. And just to tie up a little bit, because we've only got a few seconds left, I want to talk just for a few seconds about the nature of Winston Churchill's contribution to the war. A very difficult subject to talk about. Right? Winston Churchill was part of a collection of individuals. The reason why Churchill gained such a prominence is because he was one of the few conservative individuals on the right who had an opposition to Nazism. Others, like Lord Halifax, had been seduced either by pacifism or by appeasement. In any case, he was, I'm not saying a lame duck, but he was part of a policy that was in fact being organized by Lord Beaverbrook, by Aneurin Bevan, by Clement Attlee, and individuals such as that nature. And his position stood on the basis that he was a member of the Conservative Party. This is what helped to strengthen his position. So I just want to take the last slide because I know I'm running out of time. Now, there are lots of quotations said by all of the individuals of the cabinet that we would look at now and say that these are statements made by white supremacists. I could pull up statements by Lord Beaverbrook, I could pull up statements by Aneurin Bevan, and I could even pull up statements by Clement Attlee. This is a statement by Clement Attlee, which talks about the creation of a new world order. And whilst in one moment he's saying that nationalism is bad, he's also saying that Britain should forge a new world order that by its default would be one in which Britain has hegemony. So what I'm saying is, in short, Churchill is relevant because he provides a reference point to help us understand British imperialism, colonialism, and resistance to Nazism, and Britain's indifference to those people who are menelated. Churchill is also relevant because he acts as a touchstone for us to understand it, but he should not be the beginning or the end of our research, but only perhaps a touchstone to them.
Thank you, Onyeka. That was very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I will now ask Madushri Mukherjee, Dr. Mukherjee, to come on screen. Yeah, there we go. Your 10 minutes starts now.
Hi, Priya. Can you stay on? I like looking at someone while I speak.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for inviting me. And I think it's terrific that Churchill College is having this discussion. So I am going to try and link the Bengal famine with Churchill's ideas about race. But to do that, I'm going to need to kind of establish some information. Okay. So just to recap some basic facts that everybody kind of knows. In September 1939, the Viceroy of India declared war on Germany on behalf of all of India without consulting with the leaders of the Indian National Congress, which was the leading party at the time. The National Congress had said that a free democratic India will gladly associate herself with other free nations for mutual defense against aggression. But in May 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister. At about, he appoints Leopold Amery as the Secretary of State for India. And Amery draws up a plan to give to promise dominion status to India after the war. And that's what Canada and Australia had. Churchill completely explodes. He says to Amery that he would, I quote, sooner give up political life at once, or rather go out into the wilderness and fight than to admit a revolution which meant the end of the imperial crown in India. So he's saying that he'd rather not be prime minister than give up India. He orders instead a hardline policy on India, and that would become the policy that Amery and the Viceroy Linlithgow would follow for the rest of the war. In March 1942, Japanese forces just smash British defenses in the Far East and occupy Burma. That has several very serious consequences. One is that the Bengali poor depended on imports of 1 to 2 million tons from the Far East. That was cut off. And also from now on, India becomes an important base for a future war on Japan. So soldiers start arriving from all over the world. By about 1943, 1944, there'd be 2 million soldiers on Indian soil, and they were all being fed on Indian grain. In August 1942, the Indian National Congress and Gandhi declared the Quit India movement. 105 battalions were deployed by May 1943 against essentially unarmed civilians. And by this time, you're already having like incipient famine, but I want to recap some of the main causes. One was inflationary financing of India's war effort. So India's entire industrial production was being used for the war. India was producing something like, 600,000 miles of cotton cloth during the war. All of its silk, all of its wool, binoculars, compasses, all of this was being produced, and it was being paid for by printing paper money because the British Indian government couldn't raise enough money. The money supply went up by up to 7 times. And that caused runaway inflation. So during the war, India would pay for all of these expenses by means of printing paper money. After the war, Britain would be liable for, it turned out to be roughly half. So a total of 2 billion pounds and 1 billion pounds of that would be paid by the UK after the war. The problem was that during the war, as this sterling debt, the amount owed to India mounted, Churchill's rage against Indians mounted as well. Scorched earth policies were undertaken in November 1942. Churchill had ordered scorched earth policies in any territories that the empire might have to cede. In practice, it was applied only in southern Bengal, I believe. All the rice and the boats that the authorities could find were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of rice were reportedly dumped into the river. At the same time, despite this shortage of rice that is already there, food exports continue throughout this period after war has arrived at India's border. And of this export, 260,000 tons was of rice. In late 1942, Linlithgow asks for an import of 600,000 of tons of wheat for the war effort. This is going to feed the army. If anything is going to be left over, it will be used to keep up the war effort, the factories. Instead, India receives 30,000 tons by May or June 1943. And the reason is that Churchill has told Lord Leathers, the Minister of War Transport, to take a hard line on any requests for shipping from India. In March 1943, starvation deaths are reported in rural Bengal, but India continues to export rice for the war effort, and it's finally stopped by the Viceroy in July after famine is raging. So famine means that mass migrations have begun and people have started like going in large numbers to cities and dying on the streets of Calcutta. This was really bad for morale because all of this army that's being built up in the east, that's Bengal. The soldiers go for leave to Calcutta and they have to step over corpses when they're entering nightclubs. That's really not very good for army morale. So the Viceroy requests 500,000 tons of wheat by the year end to keep up the war effort. At this meeting on August 4th, the War Cabinet does not schedule any relief at all for India. Instead, Churchill decides to build up a new stockpile of wheat in the Middle East to feed the Balkans civilians after they have been liberated. So this stockpile can only be used after the war is over. At subsequent meetings, there are some shipments of wheat authorized. Churchill also turns down offers of rice and wheat from the US and from Australia. But 10,000 tons of wheat does arrive from Canada because the Canadians had already shipped the wheat. So I'm going to turn now to drawing a contrast, and I will explain why I do so. The United Kingdom received 27 million tons of food and raw materials during 1943. And by December 1943, its stockpile reached 18.5 million tons. Now, I bring this up because every time the request for food relief was sent from India, Churchill and the War Cabinet said, we don't have enough ships. So what were those ships doing? And this is what I show in my book. The ships were all providing for the United Kingdom. And in fact, it was providing far more than was necessary because the United Kingdom was building a stockpile. And I argue that the purpose of this stockpile was not that it was essentially necessary. By this time, the tide of war was turning. The purpose of the stockpile was to hoard, basically, so that the United Kingdom could sell food to Europe after the war at high prices. So just to give you a sense of what were the imports at this time, I want to draw your attention to the bottom of this list. The tea came from India, and that's a lot more shipping than was released to send famine relief to India. So now I will try to draw the connection between Churchill's white supremacy and the famine. So this is when he went to India as a cavalry officer. He stopped at a military camp where he sang this song with fellow officers, and he said it inspired him with noble sentiments. He commented about the superfluous millions who were dispensable. And in 1945, he said, he spoke of the pullulation of Hindus. Now, the word pullulation means rapid breeding. So I want to argue that these ideas, these Malthusian ideas, that famine is because of rapid breeding, was something that he held his entire life. And another belief that he held that was part of this social Darwinian structure was that the British lion was a top predator. It was the apex predator. And the prey, who we can see are rabbits. That's Indians that he's speaking about. Pretty much, throughout his political career, he's speaking of Indians as rabbits. It's the prey species that feeds the predator. It's never the other way around. And I believe that that has everything to do with the lack of relief for the Bengal famine.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Madhusree. And I think we'll move straight over to Professor Kehinde Andrews.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. Okay. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for turning up as well. So I'm going to talk about Churchill. I'm going to draw a bit on what my other two distinguished speakers have said before as well. I mean, really, the argument that I want to make is that if you think about Churchill, there is no debate about his white supremacy. It's pretty much on record. The question here is, why is Churchill still hold the level of popularity that he does, right? I mean, I've been in more than one public confrontation about Winston Churchill, and there is a kind of, it's almost like he's been beatified, right? A saintly figure who's beyond reproach. And it's actually interesting because at the time, Churchill wasn't even that popular at the time. I mean, he was never elected. And after this war effort where he supposedly single-handedly led the world against the Nazis, he actually lost the election. So this is a kind of historical replacing him back on this pedestal. And the question you'd have to ask is, why is that? And so the argument I'm going to make here is that it's because he kind of is the perfect embodiment of white supremacy. If you think about the politics, think about his ideas, think about what he did, and some of the examples we've already seen. And why that has a mythic status is because that white supremacy is still the politics of the day, right? Like, we like to pretend that things have changed, that the logic of the British Empire and empires generally has shifted, we've moved beyond race, etc. But that's nonsense. In fact, the world is still governed by the same white supremacy as it was in Churchill's day. It just looks a bit different. And so if you were to really have an honest assessment of Winston Churchill, his legacy, what he did, you would then have to have an honest assessment of the British Empire, where we are today, and also what happens in the world today. How do we have the wealth that we have? what does the world look like today? And to do that would bring the whole thing on, would unravel the whole thing. So that's the reason why figures like Churchill are so popular. This is an argument that I do make in my just published book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rules the World. I'm contractually obliged to kind of plug the book, so I'm going to get it out of the way now. I'm going to drop a link in the chat if anybody wants to find a copy of the book, and we don't have to talk about it again. But there you go. I did my contractual obligation. But this is basically the argument I'm making through the book, which is, if you think about the Nazis, and this is also important, why Churchill in particular, it's because of that Second World War, and anybody who has grown up in the British school system will know, or Britain generally will know, that the Second World War is this, like, this is the big achievement of Britain, right? This is what Britain's contribution to the world is, beating the Nazis, the evil Nazis. And with that narrative is so problematic for a number of reasons. One, obviously, Britain was an ally. There's lots of reasons why Britain won, why the war was won, notably Russia and other parts of the world, but also the colonies as well. So this was a world war, and there were millions of black and brown people involved in this. But the reason why it's such a problematic narrative is because it really does tell us how we misunderstand race. So the Nazis become the bad guys of history, this kind of evil outlier, they're so terrible, never again, how do we make, and if you look at how we approach racism, it basically is, how do we keep out people like the Nazis? That's it. How do we legislate them out, or we keep them from power, or we put them in prison? That's what racism is. And this is why people, when you say someone like Churchill's a racist, this is why people get so upset, right? Because Nazis are racist, he was fighting a racist, so he can't possibly be racist. And this is a really terrible way to understand racism, or to understand the Nazis as well. So the Nazis aren't an aberration. There's a book by Zygmunt Bauman called Modernity and the Holocaust, which I do recommend everybody reads. Excellent book, where he makes the argument, actually, no, the Holocaust could not have happened in any other social formation than Western modernity. Like, it's not an outlier at all. It's the complete logic of the West. Just the only difference is that it's brought to bear in Europe with people we would consider white, right? If you actually think about the mechanics of what the Holocaust was, genocide, killing millions of people because they'd been deemed racially inferior. We'd seen that before. This was not new. This was not a novel thing. This is kind of the foundation of what the West is. In fact, if you chart the West to 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, what is the first, that is kind of the main springboard through which everything else comes from. And what is the first act of Europe in the Americas? It is the largest genocide that's ever existed on the planet, killing up to the midpoint estimate of people who died in the Americas is 70 million people. Like, it's insane the amount of people that killed. I actually don't understand the science of this, but apparently there were so many people killed, the temperature of the earth actually rose. I mean, I can't explain why that is, but that seems to be a massive impact on the planet. And if you think about, trace how the West emerged, there's that genocide, then there's slavery in the Americas. We take millions of people out of Africa. The death toll there is again staggering. And then you have direct colonialism, and you see actually this kind of genocide, because people are deemed to be inferior, less than white people, is the operating principle of Western modernity. So the only real difference is with the Holocaust is that it comes into Europe. This is what Amy says there's a boomerang effect of fascism where it comes back into Europe. So if you were going to paint the Nazis as racist and Churchill as the good guy, I mean, that's literally, that makes zero sense. The same eugenics that Dr. Onyeka talked about with people like Francis Galton, racial science, the stuff which Churchill firmly believed in, right? The superiority of the Aryan race, the idea that white people were so civilized the barbarians. Those ideas are these very same ideas through which the Nazis came to power. They're not like even parallel, they're the same, right? Same science, same people, same mechanics, same all of it. There's a chilling story that Angela Saini talks about in a book, Superior, where she's tracing the history of racial science. And Adolf Eichmann, who's one of the kind of principal Nazi scientists who's really important in the Nuremberg laws. He's, where do they get these ideas and cut their teeth for the idea of racial science and what they're going to do? What later happens in Germany? It's in Southern Africa, right? So in Southern Africa, there is this mass genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century of the Herero and Nama people, where up to 250,000 people are killed by the Germans. And again, this is very clearly Africans are inferior, white people are superior. We're going to measures. This is where you start to get as different measurements. They don't just kill them, they kill them and take their skulls, right? The bones of it, and then they measure them. This is where you kind of get phrenology from. And these thousands of skulls are still actually in Germany. Many of them are still in Germany, haven't been repatriated. But they weren't just in Germany. These skulls were also disseminated across Europe, and other Europeans did the same thing. There was a kind of consensus that this was a legitimate thing to do with people who were non-European. And then you could measure and see who, and if you actually look at eugenics, the framework of it, where does it come from? It comes from that colonial slaughter. Now, the chilling story that Angela Sani tells in her book is that Adolf Eichmann actually was friends with Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson was Francis Galton's protege at UCL, University College London, and Eichmann actually gave him, so in Namibia, when they were deciding who they would kill and who they wouldn't kill, they had a box with different shades of hair color, 50 different shades of hair color. And if your hair color was too dark, you could be killed, and your skull would be then used for research. And he shared this, basically gave this box to Pearson, and so and Pearson took it, and they were that close colleagues. So this was actually in Pearson's possession, and this was the basis of not just eugenics, which is, I mean, it's a whole other debate which you could ask me about, but statistics. So actually, if you think about social statistics, eugenics is the foundation of social statistics, which is the whole problem. It gives you a whole problem there. And if anybody's ever done, I did psychology for my sins. I did a psychology degree and did a Pearson's correlation. Well, Pearson correlation is Karl Pearson, who was this terrible racist eugenicist who really did really did not like the Jews. So this idea that Jewish people get racialized into the subhumans who the Nazis then dispose of, that very much is eugenics, and that very much is the racial science, which again, Mr. Churchill was absolutely supportive of. So the idea that these are separate things is complete nonsense. So once you understand the Nazis are actually the product of modernity and far closer to Churchill than we would like to expect, then that should make us rethink all of our assumptions. What was the project? What was going on? What was the aim? When Britain when the Allies won the war, when we declared the end of racism, what did we actually do? All we really did was we shifted from an old version of white supremacy to a new version of white supremacy. So because of the horrors of the Holocaust, there's this UNESCO statement in 1950 which says, we shouldn't use race anymore, we should use ethnicity, and we just replace race with ethnicity. And now it's Black people are culturally inferior. Asians are culturally different, right? And you get this, you still have the hierarchy. And what I would draw your attention to is look at a map of global inequality by GDP, and you will find very clearly Africa is the poorest continent in the world where the Black people live, place where white people live are the richest, and there is a hierarchy in between. We have literally created the world in the image of white supremacy, and Churchill is just a representation of that, the perfect representation of that, which is why he's so defended, because to undo the myth of Churchill is really to undo the myth of the West.
Thank you, Kehinde. We've got a few minutes to discuss between ourselves. Can I ask Madhusree and Onyeka to come on screen, please, and to unmute yourselves. Thank you all three very much for that thoughtful and provocative discussion. I'm going to start with a point I made in my own opening remarks and ask each of you what you think. Do you think it is difficult to talk about Churchill and his legacies? And if so, why? What accounts for some of the emotions that we have seen around this particular event, but also other events that each of you have been at where Churchill comes up? It seems to me that Churchill in particular elicits very, very strong feelings. Where does that come from?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there are certain figures, people like Columbus, people like Churchill, people like Immanuel Kant, actually, who I didn't know anybody even knew who he was until you go on TV and say Kant's racist, and then you get slated by lots of people. So there are these kind of key figures who are really important to the myths that we like to tell about ourselves. And I was saying that Second World War is such a big one. It's such a huge one for Britons, particularly in Britain with the kind of supremacy and the island story, and aren't we great? And look what we did for the world. I mean, Churchill's basically wrapped up in the second. He's the Second World. He's the embodiment of the Second World War and British progress. And so to try and undo any of that, it's such an important part of the British identity that's why you get all this emotion, and you just can't have a really rational discussion.
Yeah, I mean, there's also seems to be specific emotion around bringing up the R word, bringing out race and racism in relation to Churchill. It seems to be particularly difficult to discuss.
I think that yeah, so much of what we understand about race is not only a social construct, it's also an emotional reaction. So the way that we have been brainwashed to think about race means that we act instinctively on our emotions, and our emotions have been racialized. So we often think, well, is there a logical reason for you acting in this racial manner? Sometimes there is no logical reason for it, because what's driving the racialized perspective is the emotion, because the racial concept has become part of the instinctive reaction of the individual's emotions. So there doesn't have to be a logic to it. It can simply be a visceral effect of seeing some faces that one doesn't like. And then one needs to rationalize why one feels that way. But in fact, it arises from the emotion, not from the logic.
So in other words, it's not easy to have a logical discussion around Churchill because fly so hard.
Certainly not in terms of privilege, because privilege by default is privilege. And those people that have privilege don't know that they have it, and that's why it's privilege. So when you expose privilege, you are exposing something that people say that they don't have, but of course they have it. That's why they don't know that they have it.
Yeah, quite. Thank you. Madhusree, did you want to comment on this or at all?
I think because I don't live in the United Kingdom, I don't face what you face all the time. So I feel that my book has actually been surprisingly well received, given how aggressive it was actually in a way. And I have been like really surprised and pleased that even someone like Max Hastings, best said that it's fundamentally sound. So I feel that the reception to my book has been much more open and accepting than I would have hoped for. I would say that in the US, there hasn't been even as much of a reckoning with Churchill's legacy as the United Kingdom has. And the United Kingdom, in the UK, you remember him from his attacks on minors and so on. People really know him much better. So I think that there's a better understanding than in the US, where he is uniformly worshipped. So I think people who don't like my book tend to ignore it. They don't respond to it because, there isn't a whole lot you can find, even if you look, that's wrong with it. And I was very careful in terms of fact checking and all that.
Do you think the worship of Churchill in Europe, or the cult of Churchill in Europe, is connected in any way to white supremacy? Onyeka made the point earlier that much of what went under the euphemisms of English-speaking peoples or the Anglo-Saxon was in fact a covert or not so covert race ideology. Do you think that?
I completely agree. I mean, Hitler's after dinner speeches, if you look at them, what he wants most of all is a copy of the British Empire, but he wants it in the Slavic countries, and that's who he perceives as slaves. He says that Russia is our India, and that's why he ends up attacking the Soviet Union. Hitler's favorite movie was Lives of the Bengal Lancers. That was a Hollywood production from 1935, in which British officers in the Northwest frontier, they performed these heroic feats. He made it compulsory viewing for SS trainees. So absolutely, Hitler was inspired by the British Empire and of course by the decimation of Native Americans. He wanted all of that for himself, only to the east.
This takes me to my next question, which again I pose to any and all of you. So in all your remarks, but particularly perhaps Kehinde's, there was a suggestion that a certain reading of Churchill, a certain mythologizing around Churchill has been made possible by elevating the war against fascism, against Nazism, to the forefront, and relegating the empire and the war against imperialism to the margins. And certainly we do know that many anti-colonial thinkers challenged the opposition of fascism and imperialism. They were anti-fascist, but they pointed out that in order to be truly anti-fascist, you also had to be anti-imperialist. Do you think that is true, that there is something of a privileging of the war against fascism and a silencing around the question of empire in Britain?
Yeah, and it has to be, because again, this is the purpose of the myth. And I think the further we get away from Churchill, and because actually a lot of people don't like Churchill because they remember, like, again, Churchill wasn't that popular. You think about the miners, working class communities, terribly unpopular. But the further you get away from people who have like living memory of that, the easier it is to embed this kind of mythology. And 100% Britain, so again, I'm involved in a lot of these public discussions. You emphasize the good side, right? Britain is against fascism. Britain's apparently, according to David Cameron, the country that abolished the slave trade. We don't remember that Britain was the premier slave trading nation. It took more people into slavery than any other country. So you have this, and this is why actually this is the term the book I'm writing now is called The Psychosis of Whiteness. I actually argue the function of these kind of myths and narratives, of this delusion of Britain being a racially progressive nation, is nothing. You can't. It's so irrational. There's no other metaphor to use. So there's no basis in fact. It does mean you completely ignore the British Empire, which again, I got in trouble. And I'm sure the Daily Mail, if you're watching, will probably pick this up again. When I just pointed out the British Empire was far worse than the Nazis. It lasted far longer. It killed far many more people. And in fact, in many ways, as you mentioned, the Nazis were copying large elements of the British Empire. That's just fact. But you state something like that, and it's like heresy, right? Because we're not having a rational conversation. We're not having a conversation about actual history. What we're having is a conversation about the delusions which are necessary to maintain today. Because again, this is not just about the past, this is about today. We still live in a world where, I mean, just think about COVID. COVID's going to kill what, 2 million people, kill 2 million people in a year. Poverty kills 9 million people every single year, and probably kill more people because of the lockdown. Because those 9 million people are basically Black and brown people, we don't care. Like, we just don't think about it, right? So the same logic still applies today. So the reason why we can't have this conversation is if you have that, understand empire, understand how we got here, understand Churchill's role, that means you have to understand what's going on now. And that means you have to make significant changes. And obviously nobody wants to do that. So we delude ourselves with these fantasy narratives.
So I guess that was going to be my next question, and maybe I'll ask Onyeka to address it to begin with. Can we make a transition from mythology to history? Can we start to understand the big picture, and how, given the kind of emotional stakes that are vested in mythologizing and in partial stories and in silences around things like race and empire, how do we start making that move from mythology to a full big picture history?
Thank you. It's a very important question. I think it's very difficult because people's attachment to mythology isn't necessarily based in reason and logic, but often based in a kind of emotional attachment. And so what one has to do is contextualize it with other things, and then the emotion will drop out. So, for example, when I have students who come with a perspective, let's say that Britain won the war. So you have to provide a context. You don't attack that head on, or you can. But if you want the students to develop, then what you do is you say, well, when you say Britain, what do you mean? Well, England. Well, you're saying England is Britain. What about Scotland? What about Wales? You cutting the Scots and the Welsh out and the Irish out? Just like that? No. Well, when you say Britain, do you include British India? Do you include the British colonial interests in West Africa, in East Africa, and Southern Africa? Do you include the parts of Oceania? Do you include Canada? Do you include the so-called Caribbean islands? Do you include parts of South America? Do you include all of these places as Britain? Certainly the people that are leading the British war effort would do. Is that what you mean by Britain? Well, I hadn't thought of it like that. So you provide a context. That doesn't mean that the person doesn't still think the same way that they thought, but at least you provide a context by which their emotion can drop out. Then you start to rationalize logically, and you say, okay, if this happened how you said, what part did the Soviet Union play in this? What part did the United States of America play in this? You know, how did these powers interact in your equation? You know, is it 1 + 1 = 2, or is there something else missing from your equation? Again, you provide a context. That doesn't mean that you are providing the absolute mechanism by which the person changes their emotional attachment to a mythological principle. It doesn't mean that, but at least you provide them with the opportunity, because you cannot force by attrition somebody to change their views or their beliefs. You can't force it. All you can do is hope to provide a context and then let the individual make their own choice on it, you know, as far as it goes. And you can contextualize, but you can't mandate it. Not perspectives, not views.
Thank you. So I'm going to put a final question to all three of you before we open up the floor to audience questions. So in the context of moving from mythology to history and understanding context and thinking about consequences for the present, what are the politics of monuments and memorials? There's been a lot of talk, obviously, around statues and commemoration. What are your thoughts on the politics of commemoration in relation to mythology versus history?
All right. Yeah, so I think it's we have to remember that the memorials are not historical artifacts, and that's if we start from the conversation that we are getting rid of history, it's a completely ridiculous conversation. The point of statues isn't historical record, is to celebrate particular things. So actually, if you look at why statues get put up, when they get put up, it's usually to make a statement about it's not usually, it's always to make a statement about the present, right? So when you have all these statues of slave traders and colonial murderers, that's a statement about the present, right? About what's acceptable in the public space. To take them all down would not be to get rid of history, it would be to say we actually want a anti-racist public space. The history is still there, right? But actually, I'm in two minds about the statue thing, because one of the easiest things you could do is you could take down all the statues of slavers and genocide, and, you know, and you haven't actually changed anything, right? Like nothing's happened, you just changed the public space. And the reality is that someone like Churchill, someone like Columbus, they do actually represent very well the logic of today of white supremacy. So if we're just going to get them down and then use it, and it's a PR exercise to cover up what's happening, there's really no point in doing it. We should keep them up and understand that that is what we should be celebrating, because that's what the world is still built on today.
I mean, a quick follow-up question though. So you're right that it's easier to pull down a statue than to undermine white supremacy. Can white supremacy be undermined in the face of the mythological and the hold that emotions have on how people think?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, empires fall. All empires fall. I mean, I think we've kind of been one of the mythologies is that this is the only alternative. There's nothing else. The West is relatively young on actually an historical timeline. There's many things that could happen and will happen. The West will either fall under its own contradictions or be pushed out of existence by revolutionary forces. There's lots and lots of ways to go about it. But what I would say is, it isn't, and this is why I'm writing this book, Psychosis of Whiteness. The way to get rid of this isn't to try and reason with those powers that be, because there's not a reasonable, you're not having a rational conversation. We've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. The way you get rid of structures is through rebellion, through resistance, through building alternatives. And if we do that, certainly the West will end, and we can build a new society.
Madhusree, do you want to? Yes, come on, please.
Yeah, you know, as someone who visits London once in a while, I've always been struck by the number of monuments to military glory. And it's so clear that that militarism is at the core of the British identity. And I think with the statues you put up, obviously they show what are the values that you worship. And to me, yes, those statues need to come down, but they need to involve a real grappling with what empire actually means, and a kind of the United Kingdom finding a new identity that isn't so fundamentally based on a false premise of glory. And I think I come at this as a physicist. I feel that reality always catches up with you, and that the sooner the United Kingdom can grapple with these ugly truths, the stronger it's going to be in the long run.
if I could ask you a follow-up question as well. I mean, you were suggesting in your, I know you didn't have very much time in your brief presentation, that race science and racism underpinned, in a sense, British policy during the famine, and the failures of the state during the famine were connected to race science. Do you think the logic of race science that was prevalent then is still with us?
I think indirectly, yes. When you look at all the refugees dying in the Mediterranean, when you look at the walls that have been put up around the wealthy countries to prevent the invading hordes of desperate people, I mean, yeah, goods are still flowing out of Africa, resources are still flowing out of Africa and the rest of the world, but the people aren't allowed to follow them. Yes, absolutely. I do think the world is still ruled by that.
Thank you. And I'll hand the last response to me over to you, Onyeka, your thoughts on commemoration and memorials and mythology.
I think, thank you for that. It's a very important question. I think we're talking about iconoclasm and the idea of what one should do. But iconoclasm as a concept, as an idea, as a theory, is as old as human existence. If you take the time when this talk is finished to look up a statue of Julius Caesar, sorry, Augustus Caesar, wrong Caesar. Yeah, you look up a statue of Augustus Caesar and you type in Augustus Caesar, statue of Augustus Caesar, you will get a statue of Augustus Caesar, which is in two parts, a head and a body. They never tell you why. They never tell you why, you know, this most famous first emperor of Rome is in two parts, a head and a body. There's a reason why, because this statue used to exist in Nubia, ancient Nubia, the kingdom of Nubia. The Nubians, when they won their independence from Roman imperialism, cut the head off and then separated the head and body, buried it in the ground, and then built a temple on top of it to justify what they've done and to draw the energy from their act. That's 2,000 years ago. Yeah, 2,000 years ago in human history. So as a historian, our attachment isn't to the object, it's to the moment that is connected to the object. Both the erection of the statue and the pulling down of the statue, the separation of head and body, and the erection of the monument on top of the statue, all of that for us is history, all of that is recordable, and all of that is of interest. We don't have an attachment necessarily to any one of those moments. Yeah. Of course, then you could ask me a question, oh, if you have a moral input in that. My moral perspective is going to be determined by my positionality. And my positionality, everybody's positionality is going to vary. My positionality is framed from a perspective, but you didn't ask me about that. You asked me whether it was relevant historically. Historically, all moments are relevant. The erection of the statue, the pulling down of the statue, and what happens to the statue thereafter. All of it is human history and all of it is important.
Thank you. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Alan Packwood, to put audience questions to the panel. Alan.
Thank you very much, Priya. Won't surprise you to know that we've had lots of questions coming in. So we've tried to sort of group them together to cover the main areas that you as an audience want to cover. And perhaps the one to start with is, do the panel think that the British school system should change the way in which it teaches history about Churchill, but presumably not just about Churchill, so that we acknowledge racist views? And would such teaching an awareness of Churchill's actions change popular opinions of him? Or would it be better perhaps then to change the focus and to teach other aspects of British history?
Okay. I don't know very much about the British school system, but I can tell you that growing up in Germany, my son was taken to a concentration camp as part of his education. I visited a military museum in Dresden, and I was astonished to see that the captions seem to have been written by a pacifist. I've also visited the Imperial War Museum in London. There is definitely an exhibit on the Holocaust. There's nothing on imperial atrocities. And it's basically a celebration of war artifacts. I was very struck by this comparison. I'm not saying Germany's perfect, but I do think that Germany's come to reckoning at least with the Holocaust.
Yeah, there's some engagement with history and with with the past and the things in the past that were not that glorious, and you don't see that much of that happening in Britain in relation to the empire. Kehinde, did you want to say something?
I mean, yeah, of course, the schools should change. We have generally not just. I mean, that the way the Second World War was taught broadly is wrong, right? I went through it myself, so I know that kind of Memphis Belle. I bet they still watch that at schools where there's no black and brown people. You know, it's just America and Britain against the rest. It's a complete nonsense narrative. Anyway, but broadly, the empire is not talked about. And considering that Britain was an empire, drew its strength from its empire, and really you can't understand anything in Britain without understanding the empire. You would think that you would teach it, right? But we still teach things like I remember we did industrial revolution in A level. And I mentioned, well, what about slave trade? And my teacher was like, well, that's not in the book. And so they just never talked about it again. But you can't understand. You don't really understand the Industrial Revolution without understanding slave trade, without understanding what's happening in India, etc. So what you basically have is a delusional understanding of the world. So, and this does explain in large part why we just left the European Union, right? Because people genuinely don't understand British history, don't understand the empire, don't understand how Britain became great. And so really believe this little island in the middle of the North Atlantic is so powerful and can stand on its own. Nonsense, right? So yeah, of course there should be a complete rewriting of how history is taught. I don't think it's gonna happen, but it would be a good thing if it did.
Alan?
Okay, well, sort of building on that, I think then, question would be, how can white British people be taken along on this journey to re-examine Churchill's history and legacy without feeling personally attacked? And how can such a re-examination help to illuminate to them what damage colonialism has done to the self-confidence and self-esteem of the colonized? And sort of linked to that, I think, is the idea that we heard a moment ago about Germany and Germany's response to the Holocaust, which is now an accepted part of the narrative of modern Germany. Should we aim for a similar memorial to the victims of empire and colonialism? Memorials in their own right, don't right the wrongs, but they set the narrative. Can the UK be as accepting of a memorial like this in Parliament Square as modern Germany is of memorials in Berlin?
I think Onyeka might be a good person to kick that one off.
Thank you. It's a good question. I don't know. I'd rather have hearts and minds than stone. Because if you've got hearts and mind, the stone that comes thereafter, but glorifies already what has taken place. I think Professor Kehinde said it quite plainly, and it's true. But I've been reluctant to say it for some time, that just the removal of statues doesn't change hearts and minds, doesn't change perspectives, doesn't change the institutional nature of racism. Okay, so the question was asked, what do we do? Okay, first of all, we have to change the institutions within this country. The institutions within this country operate wrongly and counterintuitive to human development because they do not operate in a fair and unbiased way. Second of all, the redressing of long-held attacks, discrimination, institutional discrimination, need to be addressed in some form, both physically, mentally, spiritually, and here comes that word again, emotionally. Because there's also some emotional there's some emotional pain that needs to be fundamentally resolved in order for individuals to be able to operate, even if there's a level playing field. Because often there's a sort of notion, oh, we've done this, we've changed this, we've changed that. Why can't you black and brown people just wake up and, you know, start switching on? You know, why can't you just start focusing? Well, because we are emotionally destabilized through a process that's been going on for several hundreds of years. I don't quantify it with 400 or 500 years, but several hundreds of years. So institutions need to fundamentally change the way in which they operate. And also there needs to be a fundamental redress of long-held institutional discrimination and inequality. The fundamental operating upon which we function of colorism, shadism, and ethnic inscription also need to change. And that is something for everybody. That isn't just about if you're racialized as being white, that is about everybody, because we've all been indoctrinated with shadism, colorism, right? And ethnic inscription that is anti-black, anti-melanated. So those are the fundamental things. Just throwing money at it isn't going to do it, but it's going to need money. Just making laws isn't going to do it, but it's going to need laws. Just changing the social policy isn't going to do it, but we do need social policy too.
Thank you. I understood one part of the question, Alan, to be how can people racialized as white be part of the journey? Was that?
Yes. Yeah. How can they be taken along on this journey? I think without feeling attacked and personally attacked and alienated.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the key thing is that one has to make a decision about what you believe in and what you are willing to separate yourself from. You know, one has to make a decision. What we are talking about is historical reality. This isn't mythological fiction. It's not fake news. It's actually historical reality that's kind of accepted by most people, even by people who still advocate a white supremacist agenda will accept that this is historical reality. Now, you have to decide whether that needs to be addressed or whether one thinks that that can be ignored. I don't think it can be ignored because it's so fundamentally destructive of the human personality. And if we as a species are going to move forward as one species, then we have to address that which has been disabling a large percentage of the same species that we belong to. If not, then not. Yeah.
Alan?
Okay, so I think then that perhaps leads into, does the panel have a positive or negative outlook on the future of the British conversation around empire?
I think, Kehinde, that's one you could kick us off with.
Okay. I'm completely negative. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like my book's called The Psychosis of Whiteness. I think you know where I stand on this. Because it's so, and I think, and I mean that because it's so embedded, right? These aren't ideas. These are ideas that are produced because of the conditions which we live in. And as long as the world is framed by white supremacy, then guess what? Our understanding of the world will be white supremacist. There's no real way around it. And even if you think of some of, I want to go back to one of the examples that someone used. I've heard this, I used a number of times, is Germany's look at the Holocaust. Well, that's great, but Germany is not in any way, shape or form engaged with its own colonial past. So Namibia, as I said, the genocide, they still have thousands of the schools of African people are still in Germany. And there hasn't really been a connection made. Even in Germany, you have that same kind of, the Nazis were terrible, isn't that bad? That's what races look like. And they haven't made the connection between that and German colonialism and British colonialism. And so, I mean, honestly, in terms of the way we go forward, it's about creating a completely alternative way of understanding this, because the mainstream way of doing it, a mainstream way of understanding it is always going to be framed by the white supremacy that dominates society. I don't know, that sounds a bit negative, but that's what I have.
I mean, I think one thing to say there also is that it's not so much positive or negative, but believing in a sense, in resistance. People have, I mean, there is white supremacy, just as there is, upper caste Brahmin supremacy in India. But it's also important to remember that these are formations that have been challenged, and that there are long histories of resistance and challenge both within Britain and in the colonies, and white supremacy, as we've seen in the last couple of years, and not just the last couple of years, has been challenged. So I think the answer is not positive or negative, but in really about, what is the power of protest, what is the power of resistance, and to think about what that can achieve in bringing down oppressive structures. Madhusree, did you want to come in on this question at all?
Not really. I don't feel I have something to say.
And I think, can I say one thing? I think that the instead of looking at the difficulty, one should look at what we want to achieve. If people believe that as a species we can move forward, then their belief in that will see that they strive for social justice, irrespective of the odds that face. If they don't believe in that, then they won't.
Can I just add a bit more positive on this? Like, we already have the other perspective. There are century traditions of decolonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial, radical perspectives which exist. So I'm not saying there's no way to understand it differently. We do. I grew up understanding it differently. The question is that going to get into the mainstream? That's where I'm more suspect about.
And we are up against very huge odds where the mainstream is concerned, because as we know, the media, the airwaves, the column inches are owned by vested interests, and you're up against a real juggernaut. Okay, Alan, I think we've got time for one or two more questions.
Okay, so does the sort of racial views you've described, the racial legacy, racial science, and those beliefs, do they have an afterlife that goes beyond the UK into the post-colonial world? So, for example, have some of these ideas been absorbed by Indian nationalists? So are they permeating not only in the West, but is the idea of Aryan supremacy also sort of prevalent in India at the moment?
I'm going to hand that over to Madhusree. I think this is a question for you.
Oh, well, I think, Priya, you could handle it just probably better than I could, but absolutely. I would say that the inferiority complex left in the Indian upper classes or by 200 years of colonial rule has kind of created kind of a knee-jerk Hindu supremacy, which is partially modeled on the actually quite literally on kind of the Nazi ideology. I think that's pretty much absolutely accurate. I also wanted to say that this is a time when around the world we're seeing the rise of demagogues who are appealing to racist sentiments. And it has been argued it's partly because we are in economically such difficult times. And I can't help wondering if there's a link between extreme inequality and desperation and racism, because people need something to cling on to.
One thing to say about the context of India, and I think this applies in different ways to other colonies, colonialism leaves a very lethal legacy. And one of the legacies it leaves is that colonialism operated with the assistance of native tyrannies. And in India, the white colonizers were linked with and collaborated with Brahminical supremacy. And today what we see in post-colonial India in the name of independence and sovereignty is a repurposing of colonial and racial ideologies left behind by colonialism in its collaboration with native tyrannies. And I think, I don't know who asked this question, but we need to be extremely alert and vigilant about that as well. Colonialism doesn't just affect the white world as ideologies go, it extends well beyond. Do we have a last question, Alan, or shall we go
Okay,
in?
so I think this is probably the last question then. And perhaps particularly given what Madhusree has just said about the rise of demagogues and dictators. Of course, an argument that could be made is that you need a strong leader to face down dictators, and that was the role that Churchill played, certainly in 1940. So do the panelists believe that the world would have been a better place without the myth and life of Churchill, or indeed without some of the other figures who've been mentioned here?
Kehinde, do you want to kick off on that?
Well, I think part of the myth of white supremacy is this idea that you have, like, it's highly patriarchal, this great white men. I mean, was it Churchill out there fighting the war? Because I'm pretty sure he wasn't. Like, I'm pretty sure he was at home. I'm pretty sure that if Churchill wasn't there, the war would still have ended in the same way, right? We kind of give these figures, this is part of the lie of white supremacy. And this is why we still do revere these dead white men. And, Churchill really is just part of that tradition of lionizing these dead white men as somehow superior and they're kind of savior and this complex that you see. Let's just do away with that completely. Look, Britain, I've always said this, Britain should be proud of its role generally in the war. It was generally a good thing, right? But then understand that in its context. Who actually fought the war it was mostly poor people sent out to the front lines. It was people in Africa, it was people in Asia, it was people all around the world. It was Russia, it was a collective effort. If we understood that better, we'd be in a much better place. Let's stop. I mean, this idea, this fascination with dead white men broadly is one of the main problems with how we think about moments in history, I'd say.
It's also about focusing on individuals at the expense of collectives and wider alliances. I mean, the fact is that if we wanted to focus on individuals, then equally one could say, well, Stalin was a great war hero, and we don't say that, and rightly we don't say that. So it seems to me that if you're questioning great man history and you're also raising the negatives of one set of people, then that has to be done with the other set of people as well. Madhusree.
Well, Churchill mythologized himself. You have to remember he lost the post-war election. And then he wrote this massive history. Oh, it's called history, but it's actually a memoir of the Second World War that places him at the center and England at the center of the action. That's the source of the Churchill mythology. Yeah, of course, it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis and the Americans who defeated the Japanese. But I also believe that if someone other than Churchill had been prime minister at the time, the death toll in the Bengal famine would not have been so high.
Right.
Thank you. In terms of mythology and the creation of one's own myth whilst one is living, this trend was well acknowledged at the time in terms of from within his own party, if we're talking about Churchill. And even more than the mythologizing that we've just been talking about, the 37 books that Churchill has written, which is an enormous number of books, of which he won, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the Nobel Prize for Literature for his books. Yeah, I believe he did. And the central body of these books is a collection of books called The History of the English-Speaking People. It's a very interesting set of books because the prominent figures almost in every edition are people that he can trace as his ancestors. For example, in volume 3, we start to hear about the Age of Reason, in which the Duke of Marlborough appears. And Marlborough can do no wrong. He can do no wrong because, he's going to eventually have Churchill as a descendant. And we can see that history is being shaped to support a mythology, but that isn't different to what men and women do who wish to obtain certain positions of power. They write themselves into history, not only the history of their own time, but the history of the past. They antedate themselves to deify themselves. So that's not an entirely atypical behavior. It's quite a typical behavior, actually.
I just wanted to comment, sorry, that the Nobel Prize in Literature usually goes to fiction.
Touché. Thank you very much. Thank you all for engaging. I think we can agree that we are all in favor of more history and less mythology. And that is a very good note on which I would like to thank Kehinde Andrews, Madhusree Mukherjee, and Onyeka Nubia for participating in today's panel and very important conversation that has to be carried on. Thank you all very much indeed. And on behalf of the college, I thank everyone who came today and who engaged with us. Thanks very much and good night.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.